I am 100% convinced that if it were a competition, I would win Who Married Best. I'm not saying that in the hopes to get brownie points, but if brownie points just happen to come my way, well, that's just bonus. But next week, Mandy and I will be celebrating our 13th wedding anniversary. And in all the time that we've been married, I have yet to figure out why she married me. I don't see what it is that she sees in me. She definitely settled in this whole arrangement. Trust me, everyone. But the longer that we're together, the longer that she and I have been together, the more convinced I am that she is exactly who I needed. She seems to be specifically and uniquely gifted to deal with my own brand of weird. Just this week, in fact, I spent a large amount of time having a conversation with her, doing my best to convince her that I desperately needed a waffle maker, hold on, that makes your waffles into the shape of the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. Honey, I still think we need to order that. It's only $50, come on. I can't wait till Christmas, all right. Anyway, but beyond all the goofiness, Mandy has always been my best friend. She's somebody who's been by my side. She's seen sides of me that I'm not proud of, sides of me that I really wish she hadn't seen, signs of me that I didn't even know were there until they were on display for her. She's held me when I've cried. She's not afraid to tell me the truth when I don't want to hear the truth. She's made me laugh harder than I ever thought I could. And she's not afraid to be the anchor of realistic expectations, because I'm a bit of a dreamer, and my dreams have a tendency to be very lofty. And so she kind of brings me back down to earth for that. She motivates me. She inspires me. Sometimes she intimidates me. But for reasons I will never understand, she has chosen to love me. She's an amazing mom. She's a hard worker. And she's just the best I could have ever hoped for in a spouse. She is exactly who I need. But in that time, what I've learned is that she's not exactly what people tend to think of when they think of what a preacher or pastor's wife should be. See, I didn't know this until we'd already gotten married, but apparently there are certain stereotypes for what a pastor's wife's supposed to be, and Mandy just ain't that. In one of our first ministry interviews where we were interviewing with a church, she was asked the question, so do you play the piano? Apparently a lot of preachers' wives play piano, and I don't think I'll ever forget the look on this particular lady's face, who had very gray hair. I'm just going to throw that out there. When Mandy told her, no, but I can play the ukulele. She's not one to sit and gossip with other people, and in fact, she's more than happy to confront you if you happen to be gossiping near her. In one instance, I actually had to physically stop her from going to stop that particular gossip. She's just not exactly, she's not going to be the one who's going to bring baked goods to all the church potluck dinners. She doesn't really like church potluck dinners, though to be fair, she was at a church potluck once that was involved breakfast casserole, and apparently one lady put mothballs in the breakfast casserole that Mandy ate. So there's a reason why she's not a huge fan of church potlucks. Okay, that was weird. She's not who people expect when they think about a preacher's wife. She doesn't stay home with the kids all day, because my wife loves to be a dental assistant. She loves working and helping to support our family. It's just who she is. But as much as Mandy is not people's ideal ministry wife, I'm going to guess that compared to Gomer, Mandy was an amazing minister's wife. But in all fairness, I'm willing to bet that Gomer was even a little bit surprised herself that Hosea asked for her hand in marriage. And in fact, I'm guessing that Hosea himself was a little surprised whenever he asked for Gomer's hand in marriage. Let me give you a little background here. We find the narrative of Hosea and Gomer in the book of Hosea, so if you want to go ahead and get turned there, we're going to be going through that today. But Hosea was a prophet of God. And this was at a time where there are actually several different prophets all at the same time. Hosea is a contemporary of Amos. He's also a contemporary of Micah, both of which are considered to be minor prophets. But also Hosea is a contemporary of Isaiah, who would have a really large book that's very difficult to understand in parts, and I was lucky to pass the class where we had to study that. But Hosea was a different person. We're going to see in the midst of this narrative, Hosea's entire life with his wife Gomer was to set as kind of a picture of the amazing love that God has for us. Hosea begins with God telling Hosea to do something that had to seem a little different. See, I'm going to guess that Hosea had different hopes for his life as a prophet. He maybe hoped that he'd be like Ezekiel, who was given a vision of dry bones coming back to life. Or maybe he thought he'd be Daniel, who again we're going to be discussing very soon, who got to see the 4 great beasts of heaven. He even probably hoped that he'd be a little bit like Isaiah, because Isaiah got to see the throne room of God. He got to see the temple filled with the train of the robe of God. But God had something different in mind for Hosea when we get to Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. God tells Hosea, says, when the Lord first spoke to Hosea, he said this to him, "Go and marry a woman of promiscuity and have children of promiscuity, for the land is committing blatant acts of promiscuity by abandoning the Lord." I got a feeling this is not who Hosea pictured as the woman God had in mind for him. The text here is kind of doing a little bit of cleaning it up, making it all nice so we don't get super uncomfortable here. But essentially what the text is telling Hosea to do is to go and marry a prostitute. A woman who spends her life giving herself to other men. A woman who very likely has lost track of how many men that she's been with. And yet this is who God tells Hosea to spend his life with, to love, honor, and cherish until death separates them. This is not exactly an ideal situation for Hosea. You got to think about that this man of God, this guy who's known as being a prophet amongst his own people, that there had to be some whispers going on there. That Hosea was giving himself over to a prostitute. There had to be some discussion amongst the people. I mean, let's be real. As much as we try to hide it or nice it up, gossip is very much a real thing amongst the church today. And I don't think that was any different back in Hosea's time. Gomer's not exactly who Hosea would have been expected to marry. And more so than that, the text actually goes, if you look at there, it says, have children of promiscuity. The implication there is that Hosea himself may spend the rest of his life wondering, are the children that my wife has given me actually mine to begin with? See, we know that this is something that had to cross Hosea's mind because of all the things that go on in Hosea chapter 2. Gomer gives him children. First, she has a boy, and God tells Hosea to name him Jezreel. Then she gives birth to a daughter, and God tells Hosea to name him Lo-Ruhamah. She has another son, and God tells Hosea to name him Lo-Ami. Now, of course, these names have different meaning, and we're going to get to those in just a little bit. But again, try to look at this from Hosea's perspective. Right? It's one thing for God to use the illustration of marriage to talk about our relationship with God. Hosea is being told to live all of this out. To live with this woman who he knows to be unfaithful to him. And as she gives birth to these children, Hosea is always going to have that cloud of doubt of whether or not they're actually his biological children. He may spend the rest of his life raising kids that are not his. Now, I want to be clear about something. There are some amazing people who will marry someone who already has children, and they will love those children as if they are their own. But understand, Hosea's situation is different. Hosea and Gomer are married by the time Gomer starts having kids. And Hosea doesn't know if those kids are his. Because when we get to chapter 2, it's come to light that Gomer has not been faithful to her husband. She has stepped out on him, not just once and not just with one person, but multiple times. We're not really given Gomer's perspective here. We don't really know why it was that she felt so comfortable in repeatedly violating her marital vows, and why it was that she felt so comfortable in leaving her husband behind to go and pursue other lovers. Maybe it was because she wasn't satisfied in her marriage to Hosea. Maybe she didn't want to marry Hosea in the first place. But maybe it was because she had gotten used to being a prostitute. Maybe she had gotten used to the money that her prostitution used to bring her. But the one thing that we do know for sure is how Hosea felt in all of this. Hosea goes through a wave of different emotions throughout chapter 2. Throughout this entire time, Hosea goes through some different dichotomies of how he feels in this particular time period. Right off the bat in Hosea chapter 2, in verse 2, we know that he's angry enough to consider divorce because he says, "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, I am not her husband." Hosea is understandably furious at his wife for what she's done. He is hurt in a way that he's never felt before. This woman that he loves, this woman that he cherishes, this woman that he has pledged himself to for the rest of his life is not showing him the same faithfulness. She's stepping out on him night after night. He's absolutely ready to write Gomer off entirely. And in fact, in verse 4, he's willing to go so far as to say, "I will have no compassion on her children," because they're the children of promiscuity. He's so angry about Gomer's multiple affairs that he's ready to go scorched earth on the whole relationship, to not just abandon Gomer, but to abandon the children that he's not 100% sure are his in the first place. Ready to write it off entirely. You might think he's going a little extreme here, willing to abandon these kids that he has promised to raise. But I think it's understandable how a man could be in such utter pain and anguishing over the actions of a wife that he loves. And he does love her, because no sooner than he's ready to just do away with the whole thing, than he comes up with a plan to maybe keep Gomer from stepping out on him, a plan to keep his wife with him, or maybe just bring her back to him. We see this plan in Hosea chapter 2, 6, and 7, where Hosea writes, "Therefore, this is what I will do. I'll block her way with thorns. I will enclose her with a wall so that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers but not catch them. She will look for them but not find them. And then she'll think, if I will go back to my former husband, for then it was better for me than now." He's thinking, if I can just stop her, some way, somehow, if I can just keep her from being able to get out and go to those older men, then maybe she'll come back to me. He wants to build a wall around her. He plants thorn bushes on the path leading away from their house. He wants his wife back. He wants her to come back to him and trust that he has her best interests in heart. He loves her dearly. He talks about the pain of knowing that she has taken gifts that he has given her. Gifts of grain, gifts of wine, gifts of oil, even gifts of silver and gold. And she's taken those gifts from her husband who's trying to win her back. And she's given them to the other men that she's been with. Taking the good gifts that Hosea has given her and handing them off to the men that she's having affairs with. He's angry at her, furious, but he still loves her. He still cares about her. He wants Gomer to come home. He doesn't want her to keep violating their marriage bed. All he wants is his wife. These compounding and conflicting emotions, they keep going back and forth. They keep tossing and turning Hosea throughout the rest of chapter 2. One minute he's angry and wants to end all of her celebrations. The next minute he wants to lead her back by going and speaking tenderly to her. It's so understandable Hosea would be in this place of conflicting emotion, of not wanting to do away with the marriage and yet wanting to do away with the marriage. He loves Gomer even though she's been unfaithful to him, but at the same time, how can any husband tolerate a wife's infidelity. After wrestling with this for some time, we're not really given a clear time frame on how long Hosea kept going back and forth. It could have been days, months, years of Hosea constantly wanting to get rid of Gomer, but wanting Gomer back. God gives him a resolution. God tells Hosea exactly what to do in Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Go again. Show love to a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress." Even though she's put Hosea through so much pain, so much torture, so much anguish, God tells Hosea to go and get your girl back. Go win her back over. Take her away from the arms of another man. If this was a movie, this would be kind of that time where the violin music would crescendo as Hosea makes his way over to her house, but it's not as simple as him just going in and taking her home. Her life now has become a little bit more complicated. And in order for Hosea to get his wife back, he has to pay a price for her. He has to pay to get his wife back. It's going to cost him something. But Hosea is willing to pay it. In verse 2, he tells us that I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, for 5 bushels of barley. In verse 3, he tells Gomer, he sits his wife down after all this time of her being unfaithful. He sits down this wife that he loves, that he's anguished over, that he's been so angry at. And yet at the heart of it all, he still cares for her. He tells her exactly what their marriage is going to be like in verse 3. He says, I said to her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be promiscuous or belong to any man. And I will act the same way toward you. Hosea recommits himself to Gomer, to saying, if you won't step out on me, I won't step out on you. You're going to be my wife, you're going to be faithful to me, I'm going to be faithful to you. This is how our lives are going to be from this point forward. To bring her back in, to bring the children back in, to recommit themselves as a family. Hosea still loves his wife, even though she's been unfaithful to him. Loves her so much that he's willing to recommit himself to a wife who stepped out on him more times than he could count. Because at the heart of it all, in spite of her unfaithfulness, Hosea loves his wife. He wants her back. He wants his wife forever. All of this, the entire story of Hosea, serves as a picture of how God viewed the nation of Israel. Everything about Hosea's life has to be tied together in this. When we're talking about prophetic books like Hosea, we have to remember that things mean other things too. There are things that take place, but they represent other things. And Hosea had to live this out. And to me, that had to be the hardest thing in Hosea's life. As a prophet, he can't just proclaim what God wants it. He's actually living this out daily with his wife because God had been faithful to Israel. We've seen this all throughout Israel's history. He'd been faithful to them all the way back to Abraham when he told Abraham that I'm going to make a great nation from you. He showed it with Moses whenever Moses brought the Israelites out of Egypt with God's help. Even just recently, he'd shown it through all the battles that they had to take place in order to gain the promised land. He was faithful to Joshua in the midst of all of this because he wanted to be faithful to Israel. When the Israelites abandoned God because they wanted to have a physical king, God loved them so much that he gave them a king. Even though they had time and time again hurt him, God remained faithful to them. But in the time that the nation of Israel had been established, Israel had been unfaithful to God. They'd repetitively done things that go against God. Specifically, they had pledged themselves to other gods. Probably the most prominent one was the god Baal. We see his name pop up all throughout, especially the Old Testament. The Israelites would go and worship Baal and then go and celebrate the special sacred festivals of God. They would gather and worship in the synagogues, and then they would go and worship Baal. And nobody seemed to have a problem with this. Not one of them seemed to speak up and say, hey, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. We're stepping out. We're being unfaithful to our God who's been nothing but faithful to us. God gave them all sorts of different things. He gave them grain. He gave them wine from vineyards. He gave them oil from olives. He helped them be fruitful and prosperous and gain silver and gold. And they were giving those things as sacrifices to another God. Israel had been unfaithful to God. They'd been promiscuous with other gods. And God was angry. The emotions that Hosea felt towards Gomer, God felt towards Israel. He was ready to be done with them forever. He's God. He could have said one word and wiped them off the map entirely and picked a new group of people. But he didn't do that. Because even though he was angry, even though he was upset, even though God was hurt, at the heart of it all, God still loved the Israelites. He still cared for them. He wanted to see their hearts turn back to him. He wanted to see them renew their passion and commitment to God. He knew that he loved them. So he chose Hosea to spend his life serving as a representation of all the things that were going on. He told Hosea to name the children specifically, to give them deeper meaning. His first child, Jezreel, the name means God sows. In that all the things that you have done that have gone away from me, I'm about to plant something new. I'm about to strip this hole away. The house of Jehu is about to be gone. Jehu had been a leader that had kind of started the downward slope for the nation of Israel. He was shortly after the reign of Solomon, and after that reign, we begin to see the Israelites really begin to pull away, and God is saying, I'm going to wipe them out, and I'm going to plant something new here. And the daughter, Lo Ruhamah. Lo Ruhamah means no compassion, which means that God is about to pull his compassion away from the Israelites. He's about to let them go through all kinds of terrible things, knowing that these are their choices, that as a result of their infidelity to God, God's about to let them face the full punishment of that. And finally, Lo Ami means not my people, hearkening all the way back to the promise that God had made to the entire nation of Israel back in Exodus chapter 20, when God said, I will be your God and you will be my people. Because of their infidelity, God is telling them, you are not my people. And as much as God wanted to write them off, and as much as God was angry with them and furious with them, God still loved them. He still wanted to call them back. So God tells them what's going to happen. He tells them they're going to go through a time of punishment, a time when the earth is going to stop producing for them, when they're going to get conquered, they're going to be enslaved once again. They're going to face these different types of punishments. And then finally, at the end of chapter 2, he says the earth will respond to the grain. After they've faced this punishment, the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the fresh oil. And they will respond to Jezreel. I will sow her in the land for myself. I will have compassion on Lo Ruhamah. And I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people. He will say, you are my God. Even though Israel has abandoned God time after time, God still wants that relationship with them. He still shows them love in the midst of their unfaithfulness. They've repetitively stepped out on God. And they're going to face consequences for that, to be sure. but God wants to bring them back. He called Hosea to go and love Gomer at the beginning of chapter 3, even though she'd been unfaithful. The rest of verse 1 says, just as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. I don't know why raisin cakes are bad, but raisin cakes are bad, apparently. Make a note for the next potluck. God told them that they would have to face consequences. That they were going to endure hardships. There was going to be punishment for the ways that they'd been unfaithful to him, but at the end of it, God would make it all right again. Chapter 3, verses 4 and 5 say, for the Israelites must live many days without a king or a prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God. And this part's really interesting. And David, who at this point has been dead for hundreds of years, David, their king, they will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. Even though the Israelites have been unfaithful to God, even though they have repeatedly turned their backs on him and violated the covenant that they had made years ago, God still loves them. He tells them they're going to have to go through punishment, but he still points to a day when not only is he going to make this right, but he's going to bring a new king from the line of David. A king that will show his love in a way that has never been seen before. A king who will show them the true love and compassion of their God. He will come and return, and the marriage between God and Israel will be restored. The story of Hosea and Gomer is a beautiful picture of an unexpected love story, of a husband who loves an unfaithful wife, a wife who cannot seem to keep herself from repeatedly violating her marriage vows, and yet her husband still pursues her. He's angry, to be sure. It's probably the most understandable part of his story. But at the heart of it all, he still loves her. His love for his wife outweighs his anger toward her. Because of that love for her, they eventually find reconciliation. After a husband pays a great price, the two are finally reunited. The parallels of this story and what is happening with the Israelites and God are unquestionable. But even more, we cannot help but draw parallels between our relationship with God and his great love for us. I don't know that God could have ever picked a better representation for us as an unfaithful wife. Those of us who profess God, a desire for his word and his voice, yet we still wrestle with sinfulness. Those of us who proclaim to love God passionately and yet actively do things that go against him. I can't speak for you. I can only speak for myself, but I can tell you that there are days where I will worship God, where I will sing his praises, where I will commit myself to his word, and then later turn around and do things that I know he doesn't want me to do. To actively pursue things that I know go against him. Times when I will loudly proclaim that I am a follower of Jesus Christ and then do things that are very much not what Jesus would have done. Times where I will speak of God's love for everyone, and then I will be the most selfish being you've ever met. In spite of my unfaithfulness, in spite of your unfaithfulness, God still loves us. His desire is for us to be reconciled with him. Even in the midst of our unfaithfulness, God is faithful. And in his faithfulness, He chose to do something extraordinary, to send his Son into the world to pay a heavy, heavy price so that we could find the redemption of God. So that in one act, all sin, from that point, from those before him, and from everyone who came again, God would show his love for us in a love that looks like a cross, and a Savior bleeding out and dying so that we could have life in God. I still wrestle with my unfaithfulness. I'm going to go ahead and assume that you do too. But even when we're not faithful, God still is. The story of Hosea shows us that God's redemption is constant. It is constant, no matter how we turn our backs to him, no matter how we have turned away from him. And I don't know about you, but I've turned away in some pretty dramatic fashions. God's love is still constant. There is no wrong that we could have done that is too much. There is no thing that we could have done that turned our back, no act of infidelity so great that God cannot forgive. If you're here today and you've never heard that before, and you're trying to tell me, Brandon, you don't understand, I'm too far gone, I've done so much, I'm here to tell you, God still loves you. He still wants you back. He still pursues you like a husband pursuing an unfaithful wife. Of all the stories that we've talked about in this particular series, of God's redemption demonstrated through the Old Testament, I got to be honest with you, man, the story of Hosea and Gomer is my favorite. Because it's a beautiful picture of a husband who loves his wife so dearly, even though she's been unfaithful to him, he remains faithful to her. It is a picture of a God who loves us so dearly that even though we continue to be unfaithful to him, he remains faithful to us and shows us that his redemption is constant. Even when, now scratch that, especially when we are not.